Great, thank you very much, Narita, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us at this late time of the day. The work that I'm presenting here with Radha is looking at the relationship between finance and employment. So I think it's something that might really fit with the themes of the WESP Club. Because we're trying to look a little bit at the question of to what extent does finance capital support good employment and or high quality employment. And I think that's a highly timely topic, and it might be interesting also for those of you who are interested in the political economy of aid as well, because we're looking at private financial institutions, but also at public financial institutions, that is international financial institutions funded by aid money. And we're trying to figure out a little bit to what extent they actually support the wider goal of creating jobs, and not just any jobs, but high quality jobs. So our starting point is the fact that many lower income countries, especially on the African continent, but I think it's by no means limited to Africa, is the challenge of creating jobs. And the challenge of jobless growth is something that has caused a lot of headache for policymakers on the African continent. So in 2018, the African Economic Outlook report concluded that in the face of rapidly growing populations and heightened risk of social unrest or discontent, jobless growth is the most serious concern for African policymakers. So generating decent employment is an issue that has become key in Africa. But the important question is, how can you actually create more decent jobs? And if you look at what academia or research has found, what we figured out was that much of the extant research has focused on the role of the state and on the role of businesses in shaping employment relations. But there's one actor, a third actor, that has been left out largely out of the discussions, and that's finance, financial institutions or finance capital, right? So we are looking at the impact that finance capital might have on the quantity and the quality of jobs. And to just preview our argument, what we find is that access to more patient sources of capital might actually enhance the quantity of jobs, that is the number of jobs created, but also their quality, that is the decency of employment. So as I said, if you look at the literature on employment relations, you find a lot of literature that looks at a relationship between the state and jobs. So for instance, there is a lot of research which looks at government and other public organizations such as the ILO, but also at NGOs. And this regulation asks, what are the factors that shape the ability and willingness to pass regulations that affect the area of work? Or what are the conditions under which the state or public institutions are able and willing to monitor and actually enforce labor regulations? And the other existing research on employment relations looks at firms. So the starting point here were a number of high-profile cases of harsh working conditions. And so firms have started to develop codes of conduct, especially from the 1980s onwards. And much of the research on employment relations that you find asks under what conditions do firms actually adopt voluntary standards, and what are the impact of these standards on employment? So that's what's out there. But what is missing here is the role of finance, and that's something where we seek to begin to filling a gap. And there are two main strands of literature that have looked so far on the relationship between finance and employment. On the one hand, we have the varieties of capitalism literature. And on the other hand, we have the literature on financialization. I say something about each of them in a minute. And what we do in our current study is we build on these two strands of literature. And these two strands of literature suggest that short-termism in finance, that is a very short-termist perspective, may negatively affect employment and labor standards. And this literature highlights the need for patient capital. So for those of you who haven't heard about varieties of capitalism and literature, it's a literature in comparative political economy, CPE, and it examines the cross-national variation in institutional environments in which firms operate, and uses institutions to explain cross-national variation in the strategy of firms, right? And the second type of literature, the financialization literature, is a literature that has emerged both in economics and in, well, political science or political economy. And financialization, if you're not familiar with the term, is it's a process that refers to the increasing role of financial motives, of financial markets, of financial actors and financial institutions in the operation of an economy. You will find a lot of definitions out there of financialization, but this is the one which is probably most encompassing. It's a very broad definition. And in both strands of literature, in the varieties of capitalism literature and in the financialization literature, there is the concept of patient capital, right? And in this literature, patient capital is usually defined as long-term funds. Funds that need to be repaid after a long period of time. And this literature provides some evidence, largely focusing on developed countries, that firms that have access to more patient sources of capital, that is long-term funds, are more likely to provide more jobs and better working conditions. And the reason for this is that these firms with long-term financing face less pressure to respond to short-term concerns about the profitability of investors by reducing their labor costs. So if you want to sort of build on these literatures on varieties of capitalism and financialization, and want to sort of use their insights to understand dynamics in a lower income country, in our case, Kenya, we see that these literatures have some limitations. As I said, most of the insights gained in these two types of literatures are based on developed countries, right? And the landscape of capital providers is quite different in lower income countries. So for instance, in most lower income countries, including in Kenya, which is our case study, financial systems are bank-based, right? And there's also an actor which is not really present in many developed countries, and that is development finance institutions. Germany has one, DFI. Do you know the German DFI? Anyone? No. It's the DFG, which is basically a sister institution of the KfW, Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau. So it's basically a public bank which finances projects funded by the state. A lot of them are in the renewable sector. So for instance, if you own property and you want to sort of update it and you want to install some renewable energy, solar energy or something, you can get funding from the KfW. So this is what DFIs do, and they usually do not work with the state, but they work with corporations. So if you're a corporation and need some money for investment, you can go to a DFI and borrow some money. And much of the literature of varieties of capitalism and financialization only makes a difference or only differentiates between banks and markets, banks and financial markets, right? But there are many more players in the financial sector, both in developed countries and in developing countries. And as the landscape of financiers differs in developing countries, so do the interests of financiers and their incentives to provide patient capital in developing countries. And as a result, the ability and willingness of these financiers to shape employment relations is also different. So there are a number of limitations in this varieties of capitalism and financialization literature besides this focus on developed countries. So one is that if they conceptualize the patience of capital, that is whether capital is actually patient or not, and they mainly look at the maturity of debt and equity, that is, how long does it take until a loan has to be repaid, right? So is it a very short-term loan or is it a more long-term loan, for instance? And this is quite a narrow conceptualization of patience, because at the core of arguments about patient capital and its impact is the concept of durable commitments. So we need to consider more dimensions of patients patient capital if we want to understand the impacts of the availability of patient capital. And much of the literature also gives very little attention to the characteristics of the holders of equity. So for instance, pension funds can be holders of equity, private equity firms or hedge funds, right? And they are quite different actors. And they might have very different expectations when they invest in a firm, right? And this might have an impact on the labor relations in these firms in which they invest, right? Because the interests and the time horizons of these different holders of capital or these different financiers are quite different. So what we do is we try to reconceptualize patient capital in the context of a lower income economy, right? So our starting point is that we consider patient capital, or we consider capital as patient when it is associated with durable commitments. And durable commitments are more than just long-term lending. And we identified three criteria. The first one is that the investment or the loan is intended for a long rather than a short period of time, right? So if an investment is very short term, if an investor just comes in and then wants to have his or her money back on a very short term basis, this is an investment that is motivated by short term performance, and it's a very low patient investment, right? Or an investment with very little patience. So for capital to be categorized as patient, it has to be more long term. And the second criterion is that the investor or lender does not exit when the firm experiences difficulties in reaction to poor short-term performance. So for instance, if there is a crisis, the financier doesn't quickly pull out of the investment because the financier is loyal, right? And this again would be a patient capital. And the third criterion that we establish is that the investor or lender is willing to take on some exchange rate risk. We consider capital as patient if the investor or lender is willing to take on some exchange rate risk, because this captures the loyalty in the face of exchange rate volatility. That is something that's quite typical for developing countries, which are quite vulnerable to external shocks, right? So the fact that an investment is long-term is a necessary and sufficient condition for capital to be categorized as patient in our study. That is, if a finance or if an investment or a loan is short-term, this capital is by definition not patient, right? But we don't consider patients as a binary category, right? It's not that a financier is patient or it's not a patient financier, but we think of it as a continuum. The starting point for capital to be considered patient is in fact that the investment or loan is long-term, because that's a necessary and sufficient condition. But the fulfillment of the other two criteria and may enhance the degree of the patience of this source of financing. And the big question then is, okay, so why would patient capital actually, in theory, improve employment relations? So what we argue is that access to more patient sources of capital may directly enhance the quantity and quality of jobs, because more patient capital providers, because the more patient capital providers are, the more they tend to care about the social performance of firms, and because they look beyond short-term profitability. And we also argue that firms in turn are responsive to the interests of financiers, because they want to avoid a situation where the financiers withdraw capital because the firms are not responsive to their interests, right? There's a second mechanism linking the patience of capital and the quality and quantity of work. So we argue that access to more patient capital for a company may directly enhance the quantity and quality of jobs for a firm, because access to more patient sources of capital enhances the space for firms to pursue long-term growth strategies, which include the expansion of the labor force or the investment in skills that may only generate profits in the longer run. And then the third channel is a more indirect one, linking the patience of capital and labor relations. So we argue that access to more patient capital may indirectly enhance the quantity and quality of jobs, because access to more patient capital may enhance firm growth, and this consequently then enhances the financial space in the firm to increase the quantity and improve the quality of work. And in order to explore this argument, we conducted a study. So Radha and I conducted 38 interviews, and in 2 rounds. One in winter 2019, and the second round was amidst lockdown during COVID. Most of the interviews, of course, were not on site anymore, but then online in November 2020. And we conducted interviews with different types of financiers, that is development finance institutions, which are largely publicly funded, private equity funds, and banks. And then we also spoke to the firms which offer the employment. That is manufacturing firms in Nairobi's SME sector. And we, of course, also spoke to other stakeholders, like representatives of the Ministry of Labor. We spoke to labor organizations, to industry organizations. And Radha is now going to share the results of the study with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Florence. To kind of give a context, we did a little bit of secondary data analysis. Kenya, as many of you know, more of the financial inclusion story, is kind of a darling of financial inclusion, and private credit on GDP in Kenya has grown a lot in the last 15 years. However, though the graph on the right side shows that Kenya does have more long-term capital than other African countries. The graph on the left shows that maturity levels, particularly of banks, still remain relatively short-term. So some quite large banks like Standard Chartered have over 80% of their portfolio in short-term loans. So this is just kind of to try to provide the context that even our first criteria of long-term is actually banks in Kenya are not doing that. However, there are other organizations that are doing more patient capital, and we provided kind of a landscape of patient capital. We can discuss this more in the Q&A, but basically we developed this to show that the landscape of patient capital is different in developing countries from developed countries, and also to push the point that we really need to move beyond this bank market dichotomy to understand patients. Next slide. So one of the main parties, one of the main actors that we interviewed were development finance institutions. And our research, our interviews showed that DFIs have both the ability and willingness to improve the quantity and quality of employment. We found that their willingness rests in their mission to look beyond short-term profitability and achieve wider social goals. So DFIs have regular reporting mechanisms to monitor the extent to which firms to which they provide funding have expanded the workforce or have improved labor standards. The ability to improve labor relations originates from the pressures that the firms seeking DFI funding want to continue to receive it. So a breach of contractual obligations would be seen to occur if a firm fails to address DFI labor-related conditions. Our interview with the DFI official showed this quite clearly, where he argued that given the importance of DFIs in this market, it's pretty rare that people or firms would take this risk. And DFIs potentially provide up to a third of financing needs in this market. The next actor that we interviewed was private equity firms. Now, a variety of private equity firms have proliferated the Kenyan financial landscape in the last 15 years. From our interviews, we found that they have both the willingness and ability to improve the quality of employment, but as we'll see, the data on the quantity of employment is a bit ambiguous. Now, this is one of the key ways that private equity firms are actually quite different in developed countries than developing countries, where they're seen to focus more on, in developed countries where PE funds are more short-term, is that most of the PE funds' willingness to look beyond short-term profitability is mainly because PE funds in Africa receive majority of their funding from DFIs. And as Florence had said when we started off with, this is the connection with kind of the aid and development debate. The ability to improve labor relations stems from the pressures that firms seeking to continue receiving long-term PE investment feel. However, the effect on the quantity of employment is more ambiguous. On one hand, PE firms may encourage an expansion of employment as part of a strategy to enhance firm growth by providing a financial base to expand staff numbers. Our research did not look at service-oriented firms in Kenya because we wanted to focus on the manufacturing sector, but you kind of can see evidence, just kind of anecdotal evidence, where you see, Javas and Good Lives expanding throughout the country due to PE investment. However, the quantity of employment for manufacturing firms was different because the drive for efficiency may result in declining staff numbers. One of our interviewers said that with PE investment, headcounts are going down. So I think, again, it's a difference between a family-owned company where you're running a marathon, whereas with the private equity co-owned space, it's definitely not patient in any sense of the word. So private equity firms, because they have kind of this sort of seven-year cycle. Private equity, the firm manager we interviewed continued, like, private equity never really looks at your past performance. It's always looking at future performance. So even if somebody had been a superstar employee in the past, if they can't contribute to the future performance, then the person has very little value. So in summary, we found evidence that PE funds had the ability and willingness to particularly improve the quality of employment, because majority of their funding was DFI funding and the DFIs were interested in that, but the impact on quantity of employment was quite ambiguous. The next actor we interviewed was banks, and as you could see from the secondary data that we presented, banks in Kenya still tend to lend relatively short term. From our interviews, we found that banks were largely concerned with the short-term creditworthiness of the firms, and they had few incentives to improve either the quantity or quality of employment. We found that it was only through public interventions, for example, where there was DFI credit or central bank pressure, that banks became a bit more patient. We used our interviews after kind of towards the end of 2020 as a lens to see this. And as soon as COVID-19 hit, the central bank put a lot of pressure on banks to restructure loans and be more patient. And we found evidence that this had a positive impact on employment. For example, one of our firms said that there was a period during COVID that literally we were not selling anything and we just had to keep going. And basically our own bank financing helped us to continue without having to reduce jobs. So as we'll see that when we look at the conclusions, that we feel that this is a lens through which we can show that the patience is not simply an exogenous factor, and there may be room for improvement. Sorry, just go back to. So another way that DFIs are impacting the Kenyan market is through lending lines of credit to banks. DFIs do not have a capacity to lend to SMEs. They mainly lend to large firms or PE funds. But the way they are fulfilling their SME lending kind of agenda is to provide lines of credit to banks. Every week, I see a new article in the newspaper. KCB gets a loan from IFC, DB gets a loan. There's a lot of activity, but it's not clear what the total level of this lending is. What we found when banks received onward lending from a DFI loan, we found evidence of increasing maturity. So because they got a more long-term liability, they were able to create a more long-term asset. We found some evidence that they were required to collect data on employment trends, but we found no evidence for them being required to monitor or collect data on compliance with labor standards. So going to some of our conclusions, we find evidence that access to more patient sources of capital may enhance the quantity and quality of jobs. As Florence had explained, we have three kind of mechanisms that we'd hypothesized or proposed in our theoretical framework. The first mechanism, we do find evidence for this, that there's a direct link between more patient capital and quantity and quality of jobs, particularly because DFIs that do provide more patient capital care about social performance. Our second mechanism that we proposed, we also find some evidence that patient capital leads to better quantity and quality of jobs because it enlarges the space for long-term strategies. We found limited evidence, just some evidence for a third mechanism where we had proposed that patient capital would lead to higher quantity of jobs through firm growth. We found kind of mixed evidence for that. Overall, our findings speak to an emerging literature that argues that capital needs to play a greater role in the social contract. As Kate Maher has argued, that we need to move beyond the didactic contract between citizens and the state, where the role of capital has been largely airbrushed. And we feel that our paper provides an initial contribution to filling this gap in the literature. In terms of methodology, our paper already also provides a conceptualization of patient capital in the African context. We show that there's a need to move beyond bank capital dichotomy. And, something that has really not been discussed in the literature, but we found it key, and we developed this inductively from our interviews, is we showed the importance of sharing exchange rate risk as part of a conceptualization of patient finance. Empirically, we showed that there are differences between various market actors, and we also provided kind of evidence of the different mechanisms that can link patient finance to employment relations. We also, as part of the study, have come up with some policy suggestions. One of the key ones is that, and this is linked to some of the data we discussed regarding COVID, is that our paper suggests that patience is not simply an exogenous variable, but that the degree of patience can be manipulated. And this means that there's room to bring finance capital back into the social contract. We argue that there's a need for transparency on data on DFIs and PE financing. When Florence and I started this project, I kind of just assumed that there'd be some web page or some database somewhere that would just kind of summarize the PE funding and the DFI funding that's come into Kenya or Africa, but really it isn't there. So there really needs to be a lot more transparency on the data. As one of the interviews we quoted say, when people in DFIs say, oh, DFIs fund up to a third of the Kenyan market, it's very difficult for us to kind of verify that figure, because the total figure is kind of a bit unknown. We'd also recommend that DFIs increase monitoring of all their investments. There was clear evidence that they monitor their debt and equity investments, and monitor not just the financial part, but the social part. And we would recommend that DFIs need to also monitor their credit lines to banks, where we did not find any clear evidence of monitoring. We feel policymakers need to try focus on long-term financing in local currency and sharing of exchange rate risks. We did not find any evidence of even any DFIs lending long-term in local currency. And finally, we feel that the regulator may be able to have a more nuanced use of liquidity ratios and encourage data collection on employment trends within banks as a way to improve the quantity and quality of jobs created. So that brings us to the end, and we look forward to your questions. These are our contacts, and